Change is not something that occurs all at once. It builds quietly, often invisibly, over days, weeks, years of accumulated suffering, reflection, and a growing sense of something being intolerably wrong. And then there comes a point, a precise and piercing moment, when the change becomes evident, not just to you, but to those around you, including the ones who have benefited from your uncertainty, your self-doubt, your willingness to carry burdens that were never yours to begin with. The narcissist in particular is attuned to these shifts, not because they value your transformation, but because it signals a loss of control, a disruption in the structure they believed was immovable. When someone builds their psychological framework on the manipulation of others, when their entire identity is constructed upon the ability to control, distort, and feed off emotional chaos, they become dependent on a specific kind of predictability. It's not the predictability of healthy structure or discipline, it's the predictability of others' reactions. They rely on you being the same person today that you were yesterday. The same vulnerable person, the same self-doubting person, the same person who will contort themselves to avoid conflict, to preserve peace, to rescue what should never have needed saving in the first place. This is not just psychological familiarity for the narcissist, it is their lifeline. Your predictability is what anchors their illusion of dominance. They know exactly how you'll respond to guilt tripping, to silent treatment, to emotional baiting. And it is that certainty that forms their illusion of superiority. When you begin to change authentically, quietly, fundamentally, they can feel it before you ever say a word. They sense it in your posture, your tone, the way your eyes no longer search theirs for approval. There is a shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to someone whose entire sense of control rests upon emotional leverage, it is thunderous. Your change destabilizes their internal compass. They don't understand it. It's foreign, dangerous, and most of all, it's a threat, not because it's inherently aggressive, but because it reveals how fragile their construct really is. They begin to panic. Not always outwardly, not always obviously, but internally, the narrative begins to crumble. Because now you're no longer dancing to the rhythm they composed. Now you're moving to a different beat, one they can't hear, let alone control. This is where the psychological war begins. Because you may still be speaking softly, you may still be honoring responsibilities, keeping the peace on the surface, but underneath you are no longer theirs, and they know it. So they escalate. They become more provocative, more demanding, more erratic. They test your resolve with increasingly absurd accusations or dramatics. They try to hook you emotionally, perhaps with sudden apologies, exaggerated gestures, or calculated vulnerability. But the difference now is that you're watching, not reacting. And this confuses them. Because before, their behavior would have evoked tears, anger, guilt, pleading. Now, there's a stillness in you, a groundedness, and it terrifies them. Their fear isn't always conscious. Many of them don't possess the introspective depth to understand what they're afraid of, but what they feel undeniably is loss, and not just of a person, but of a role, of power, of psychological shelter. They have no inner world strong enough to support them without external validation. Your shift forces them to face a reality they have long suppressed, that their control is not real, that their dominance is only as strong as the permission you unknowingly gave it. When you stop being predictable, you start being dangerous to their narrative. Because your transformation is not just about self-preservation, it's about truth. And truth has the uncanny ability to expose deception without even trying. The moment you change forever is the moment they realize they can no longer access your emotional world, that they can no longer bend it to suit their needs, that your empathy is no longer their weapon, but your shield. And in that recognition, something fractures in them, because now they are confronted with what they've always avoided, themselves. And there is nothing more terrifying to someone who has built their identity on illusion than facing the raw, unfiltered reality of who they are without control over someone else. They may attempt to reclaim that control through cycles of hoovering, idealization, sudden bursts of affection or rage, but it no longer works. Because what they don't understand is that your change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, a quiet awakening, the kind of shift that happens when you finally recognize the cost of peace maintained at the expense of your soul. And once you see it, truly see it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back, you don't want to. And they feel that in their bones. It's not about revenge, it's not about getting even, it's not even about proving a point. It's about reclaiming what was always yours but temporarily lost. Your agency, your voice, your vision of yourself, not defined by their projections. And to someone who thrives on psychological captivity, your freedom is chaos, it's destabilization. It's the beginning of the end for the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. And the tragic irony is that they'll never fully understand what broke the system, because it wasn't an argument or a confrontation or a dramatic goodbye. It was your quiet evolution, your refusal to remain predictable, your unspoken declaration that you will no longer be a character in their story, but the author of your own. When you stop chasing their validation, when you let go of that persistent inner hunger to be seen, to be heard, to be valued by someone who never had the capacity to offer those things honestly, you collapse a structure that they assumed would last forever. You break a cycle they were counting on you to keep alive. Because the narcissist thrives not on genuine connection, but on pursuit, the pursuit of admiration, the pursuit of control, the pursuit of being the center of someone else's psychological universe. And when that pursuit ends, when you pull back and stand still, it creates a vacuum they cannot fill with performance or pretense. You rob them of the very fuel that animates their persona, your emotional need for their approval. See, the narcissist's identity is not fixed, it is reactive. It's an ever-shifting mask crafted by what others reflect back to them. They don't know who they are in the quiet moments. That silence is unbearable. So they depend on others, especially those with high empathy, with deep emotional needs, to constantly affirm a distorted sense of self. They draw out your insecurities, only to become the distorted mirror offering a conditional sense of worth. And that keeps you coming back. But when you no longer need their recognition, when your self-worth begins to take root in something internal and stable, it forces them to confront a crisis of irrelevance. They feel it in the withdrawal of your gaze, in your disengaged tone, in the way your silence starts carrying more authority than your words ever did. This is deeply unsettling for someone who has manipulated perception as their primary tool of survival, because now they are no longer the author of the narrative. You are not reacting the way they expect. You're not collapsing under the weight of their withdrawal. You're not pleading. You're not chasing. You're just there, stable, composed. And that throws them into a kind of existential vertigo. Because if you no longer need them, then who are they? And if you no longer respond to their tactics, then what power do they actually have? The answer, none. But that's an unbearable truth for someone who has built their self-worth on being the puppet master in someone else's emotional theater. They may try to escalate. They may intensify the games. Maybe they'll suddenly shower you with affection. Maybe they'll remind you of how special you are, how much they see you, how unique the connection is. It's not love, it's strategy. It's a reflex born out of fear. Because your detachment, your self-possession, your refusal to play the role they cast you in, it terrifies them. It terrifies them of their disguise. And more importantly, it reminds them that the world does not bend to their delusions, that their manipulations only work on those who are willing to trade self-respect for belonging. And once you stop making that trade, once your soul says no more, they are exposed. Not to others, at least not always, but to themselves. That moment for them is often unconscious. They might not be able to articulate it, but they feel it like a tremor in the floor beneath their feet. Something shifts, something breaks. And the worst part for them is that they cannot fix it. Not with charm, not with threats, not with grand promises of change, because you're no longer looking to them for wholeness. You're no longer handing them the keys to your emotional home. You've learned, perhaps painfully, that their praise was a leash, not a gift, that their affection was currency, not care. And in withdrawing from that economy and stepping out of that transactional model of worth, you become free. And freedom to the narcissist is the ultimate threat, because it proves that their influence was never love, it was dependency. There's a kind of grieving that takes place in them, though it's not the grieving of love lost, it's the grieving of control lost. The narcissist doesn't mourn you, they mourn their hold on you. They mourn the predictability of your pain, the reliability of your self-doubt, the comfort of knowing exactly which buttons to press. And when those buttons no longer work, when your emotional responses no longer orbit around them, they begin to unravel. Not necessarily in dramatic or visible ways. Often it's quiet, secretive, deeply internal, a kind of silent panic. Because now they are left with themselves. No audience, no mirror. Just the fragmented remains of a self they never truly knew. And this is where the real shift begins. Not in them, but in you. Because what you've done is not just withdraw affection or attention, you've dismantled the entire system by which they derived significance. You've taken back your need to be seen and redirected it inward toward your own healing, your own growth, your own grounded identity. And there's no strategy, no performance, no seductive apology that can compete with that kind of clarity. When you no longer need them to feel whole, they realize they were never the source of your strength, only the shadow blocking your light. When you begin to speak the truth, your truth, not someone else's version of it, you initiate a chain reaction that the narcissist has no defense against, because truth, in its unvarnished form, has a peculiar property. It doesn't cater, it doesn't plead, it doesn't manipulate, it just is. And people who have built their identity on distortion, performance, and illusion cannot stand in its presence without being exposed. The narcissist operates in a space where language is used as camouflage, where words are crafted not to communicate, but to control perception, to seduce or to shame, depending on what the moment demands. So when you begin to use language not as a tool of persuasion or self-defense, but as an expression of alignment between what you believe and what you say, you break a code they depend on. You become unpredictable, not because you're erratic, but because you're finally congruent. Congruence terrifies the narcissist. To say what you mean and mean what you say, especially in the face of potential conflict or rejection, is an act of rebellion to someone who thrives on ambiguity. They prefer fog, not clarity. They need that margin of uncertainty to keep you guessing, doubting yourself, recalibrating your behavior in the hopes of earning consistency. And when you instead become consistent in your own values, your own speech, your own emotional truth, you deny them the game. Because you're no longer trying to win them over. You're not trying to keep the peace at the expense of your soul. You're simply being, and being fully. That is profoundly destabilizing for someone who uses emotional chaos as leverage. This isn't about shouting or dramatic revelations. It's often quiet. It's in the way you say, "That's not acceptable," and mean it. It's in the way you stop explaining your boundaries, like they're up for negotiation. It's in the tone of your voice that no longer carries apology for existing. It's in your ability to sit in silence and let the tension rise without flinching, because you've finally made peace with discomfort. And that discomfort, yours, theirs, is what truth brings to the surface. Because truth doesn't always soothe. Sometimes it scorches. Sometimes it exposes wounds that haven't yet healed. But it always liberates. And when you begin to value that liberation more than you fear rejection, you outgrow manipulation in a way that's irreversible. The narcissist depends on your silence as much as your attention. They rely on your reluctance to name what you see. They count on your fear of escalation. So when you speak truthfully, not cruelly, not vindictively, but with grounded clarity, they encounter a version of you they cannot control, and that version threatens the entire scaffolding of their power. It's not about being confrontational for the sake of it. It's about the refusal to live in contradiction, the refusal to act like you're okay when you're not, the refusal to gaslight yourself into believing that being treated poorly is somehow your fault. And that refusal is contagious. It spreads through your posture, your presence, your eyes. It tells them and everyone else, this person has reclaimed their voice. There's a difference between reacting and responding. When you react, you're still in the system. You're still emotionally entangled. But when you respond from a place of clarity, you are no longer part of the emotional theater. You're not performing, you're not waiting for applause or bracing for attack, you're just stating what is. And that unnerves someone who has made a career of distorting what is. Because now you are the reference point, not them. Now you are the stable axis around which the chaos begins to unravel. And that's something they can't replicate. They can mimic empathy, mimic vulnerability, mimic accountability, but they cannot mimic integrity, not sustainably, not when it's tested, not when you hold the line. They might retaliate, they might smear, they might sulk, but you're not responding to the theatrics anymore. You're responding to the truth in you and letting that be the compass. And as that internal compass grows stronger, your sensitivity to manipulation weakens. You start noticing the dissonance faster. You start recognizing when you're being nudged off course. And each time you realign, you become more dangerous to them. Not because you're vengeful, but because you're immune. And immunity in a system built on emotional contagion is the ultimate threat. Because once you see the pattern and name the pattern and stop participating in the pattern collapses. This is how the truth moves. Slowly, then all at once. And it doesn't need permission. It doesn't need approval. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it, even if their voice shakes, especially when it shakes, because that's when it matters most. When everything in you says stay silent to keep the peace, but you speak anyway, that's when the spell breaks. That's when you realize they were never strong, they were just loud. They were never wise, they were just manipulative. And they were never in control, you just hadn't claimed your own yet. But now you have. And once you taste that alignment, once you feel what it's like to walk through fire and not burn, only then do you understand the kind of power that cannot be taken, only lived. When you disengage emotionally from someone who thrives on eliciting a reaction, you disrupt their entire framework of control. It's not just the silence that unsettles them, but the quality of that silence. The fact that it's deliberate, grounded, and no longer born out of fear or defeat. You're not silent because you're crushed or unsure of what to say. You're silent because you've seen the futility in participating in circular conversations designed not for resolution, but for domination. You've recognized that engagement, no matter how logical or compassionate, will never lead to reciprocity, only to a deeper entanglement in dysfunction. That realization is sobering. It's also a signal of psychological evolution. People often misunderstand emotional detachment. They confuse it with apathy or weakness or even bitterness. But true emotional detachment, especially from a narcissist, is one of the clearest markers of healing. It's a sign that you're no longer trying to prove your worth in a game rigged from the start. You're not chasing closure, not waiting for accountability, not hungering for validation from someone incapable of providing it. Instead, you've located your center and you've begun to fortify it. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you resilient. And resilience to the narcissist is deeply threatening. They've spent years, maybe decades, fine-tuning their ability to provoke a raised eyebrow, a passive-aggressive comment, a carefully timed withdrawal of affection. These are tactics, not quirks. They are engineered to test your emotional reflexes, to see whether you'll twist yourself into knots again in pursuit of peace, of approval, of love. And when you respond with calm or distance or nothing at all, they are forced to confront a terrifying possibility that you are no longer under their influence, that they cannot reach you in the way they used to, that you've outgrown the need to dance for crumbs. This creates a crisis for the narcissist, though they would never name it as such. What they experience instead is a sudden loss of identity reinforcement, because their sense of self is parasitic. It feeds on reactions, especially from those they once trained to mirror their moods and absorb their projections. Without that constant feedback loop, they begin to unravel, not necessarily in ways visible to the outside world. They may appear composed, successful, even charming to others, but internally there is chaos, because their control was never about strength, it was about fragility, about building a fortress of delusion that requires constant upkeep. And when you stop supplying the emotional bricks, the walls begin to crack. At first, they may try to re-engage you using familiar methods. A baiting message, a veiled insult masked as concern, a sudden gesture of affection that feels eerily out of place. These are tests, attempts to pull you back into the narrative where they are the center and you are the supporting character. But if you've done the internal work, if you've learned to spot the manipulation, not just intellectually, but somatically, you won't take the bait. You'll notice the unease in your chest, the tension in your jaw, the drop in your stomach. And instead of ignoring those signals like you used to, you'll honor them. You'll pause. You'll choose not to respond. And in that space of choice, your power returns. The narcissist interprets this power as arrogance or betrayal. But that's only because they equate control with love. They cannot fathom a relationship that doesn't hinge on dominance or submission. So when you refuse to play either role, you're not just confusing them, you're redefining the terms of the entire interaction. And that redefinition is not merely personal, it's philosophical. You're stating with your silence and with your non-engagement that dignity matters more than comfort, that integrity matters more than harmony. That your peace is not up for negotiation, especially not with someone who thrives on stealing it. Over time, they may escalate. They may weaponize your calm against you, telling others you've changed, that you're cold, that you're the problem. This, too, is part of the script. It's designed to trigger your old wounds, the ones that made you vulnerable to their tactics in the first place. But if you can hold steady, if you can continue to live your truth without needing to defend it, you'll watch those accusations lose their power. Because truth doesn't need defense, it needs embodiment. And when you embody that truth, when your actions align with your values, you become immune to character assassinations disguised as concern. That immunity is hard-earned. It comes from confronting not just their darkness, but your own. From asking the painful questions. Why did I tolerate this for so long? What did I believe about myself that made this dynamic feel normal? What part of me still craves their approval, even now? These are not comfortable inquiries, but they are necessary. Because without them, detachment becomes a performance, not a transformation. And this journey is about transformation. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned in the name of survival. It's about choosing wholeness over illusion. And once you've tasted that wholeness, you'll never settle for emotional crumbs again. When you understand the power of your absence, you begin to see how much of your presence was taken for granted. And not just in a passive way, not just through forgetfulness or distraction, but through a calculated kind of consumption. You were studied, assessed, your habits were memorized, your kindness monitored, your reactions logged like data points in a system designed not to connect, but to control. The narcissist doesn't just rely on your presence, they require it to function. They require your eyes to reflect their image back to them, your voice to echo their false narratives, your energy to keep their ego alive. So when you remove that presence, when you stop showing up in the same emotional patterns you once did, it's not a minor shift. It's an existential threat to the structure they've built. We're not talking here about petty revenge or silent treatments. We're talking about genuine absence that stems from awareness, from clarity, from finally seeing the truth and making the quiet decision not to feed the dynamic anymore. That kind of absence has weight. It's a mirror they can't avoid. Because it doesn't come with fanfare or declarations. It comes with stillness. And that stillness forces them to confront their own noise. The chaos they once projected onto you now echoes back at them, unfiltered, unmitigated by your efforts to make peace, to soften the blow, to carry more than your share. The mistake most people make is assuming the narcissist doesn't feel this loss, that they move on effortlessly as if you never mattered. But this interpretation misses the deeper dynamic. They do feel it. They feel it in the disintegration of control. They feel it in the breakdown of their narrative. They feel it in the silence that once meant power, but now means abandonment. Because your absence removes more than your body from the room. It removes your compliance. It removes your emotional labor. It removes your willingness to edit yourself for their comfort. And once they lose that, what's left is a version of themselves they can't bear to face. They may replace you quickly, they often do, but replacements aren't solutions, they're distractions. And those distractions come with their own set of problems because each new source of supply eventually notices the same cracks, the same emotional emptiness, the same lack of empathy, the same need for admiration without intimacy. And when those cracks start to show again, as they always do, the narcissist feels the difference because not all supply is created equal. You weren't just another mirror. You were a high-quality one. You reflected their best lies back to them with depth, with feeling, with an authenticity they couldn't replicate on their own. And now, without that reflection, they are left with a distorted image, one that flickers under scrutiny and collapses under pressure. What's so threatening about your absence is that it reveals the truth of your role in the relationship, that you weren't weak. You were strong in ways they couldn't comprehend. You carried the emotional weight. You smoothed over the disruptions. You maintained the illusion of connection when in reality you were the only one truly connecting. And now that you're gone, the system is exposed. The scaffolding falls away. And what's revealed is a hollow center wrapped in a persona that cannot sustain itself without external reinforcement. So they spiral, maybe not publicly, maybe not in ways the world can see, but internally there's a rupture, a splitting between the image they present and the truth they cannot integrate. They may overcompensate, become louder, more grandiose, more demanding of attention. But this is a defense mechanism, not a sign of confidence. It's the flailing of someone who cannot stand still, because stillness is where the shame lives. Stillness is where the truth lives. And truth for them is intolerable. Your absence creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum they begin to hear things they've long silenced. The insecurity they buried under superiority, the envy they masked with contempt, the self-loathing they painted over with charm, it all begins to rise like smoke through the cracks in a once polished mask. And though they may blame you, mock you, or pretend you never mattered, these are just attempts to reassert control over a narrative that's already slipped from their hands. You've changed something fundamental by walking away, not just in the dynamic, but in the way reality confronts illusion. You've shifted the terms of engagement. You've said, without saying it, that you will no longer be manipulated into betraying yourself. And that message reverberates, not because it's loud, but because it's true. And truth, especially when it's lived out through action, not argument, has a way of dismantling even the most carefully curated deceptions.